I have learned that the most dangerous assumption in any room is believing the smartest person is always the easiest one to recognize. At exactly 9 o'clock on a crisp autumn morning, Hayes Technologies welcomed some of the brightest minds in America into its Executive Innovation Center overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected golden sunlight across polished marble floors while dozens of engineers, economists, artificial intelligence researchers, and corporate strategists prepared for a challenge that would determine the future of a $15 billion international partnership. The atmosphere carried an unusual mixture of excitement and quiet fear because everyone understood the stakes. If the company's predictive intelligence platform failed today's final evaluation, years of negotiations would disappear before the overseas markets opened. Christopher Hayes stood near the enormous digital display that covered the entire front wall of the executive boardroom. At 40 years old, the white billionaire had earned a reputation for making impossible decisions with remarkable confidence. Investors trusted his instincts. Competitors respected his discipline. Employees admired his relentless pursuit of excellence. Yet this morning, even Christopher could feel the weight pressing heavily across his shoulders. 3 massive screens displayed millions of constantly changing calculations, market forecasts, supply chain simulations, and artificial intelligence decision trees. Bright red warning indicators continued flashing across the presentation, reminding everyone that the system had reached a contradiction no one could explain. 25 specialists representing some of the country's most prestigious universities and technology firms had spent nearly 8 exhausting hours reviewing every equation, every algorithm, and every assumption. They challenged one another's conclusions, rebuilt entire sections of the predictive model, and launched hundreds of new simulations. Every attempt produced the same devastating result: failure. Silence slowly settled over the room as another respected analyst leaned back in frustration. There is no mathematical path forward, he admitted quietly. A senior artificial intelligence architect shook his head. The model is internally consistent. If it predicts failure, then failure is the correct conclusion. Around the conference table, expressions of confidence gradually disappeared beneath exhaustion. Richard Lawson, Hayes Technologies' executive vice president, adjusted his expensive navy suit before speaking with firm conviction. We assembled the finest experts available. If none of them can solve this challenge, then nobody can. Christopher remained silent. His blue eyes never left the glowing display as the digital countdown clock continued moving toward zero. Only 65 minutes remained before the final decision had to be delivered to international investors. Outside the executive boardroom, another ordinary workday quietly continued. Administrative assistants prepared afternoon schedules. Attorneys reviewed legal contracts. Receptionists welcomed arriving guests with professional smiles. At the far end of the hallway, almost invisible among the movement, Zoe Mitchell slowly pushed a housekeeping cart toward the executive floor. At 27 years old, the black housekeeper had worked inside Hayes Technologies for nearly 3 years. Every morning, she polished conference tables until they reflected the morning sunlight, carefully aligned executive chairs, replaced freshwater pitchers, and quietly prepared meeting rooms before anyone arrived. Most executives appreciated her work without ever learning her name. As Zoe reached the open doorway of the executive boardroom, the bright crimson warning lights from the enormous display reflected briefly across the polished floor. She glanced toward the screen while continuing to guide her cart forward. Something immediately caught her attention. Her calm expression changed ever so slightly as her eyes followed several lines of predictive logic moving across the display. She slowed her pace without realizing it, studying the equations for only a few silent seconds before looking toward the group of exhausted experts. Inside the room, another specialist announced that every possible solution had already been tested. Richard Lawson nodded confidently, ready to recommend ending the evaluation. Christopher slowly closed the presentation folder resting on the conference table, preparing himself to accept the greatest professional disappointment of his career. Then a gentle but unmistakably confident voice interrupted the silence. "Excuse me, sir." Every face turned toward the doorway. Zoe stood quietly beside her housekeeping cart wearing her simple gray uniform, meeting Christopher Hayes' eyes with calm respect instead of fear. She spoke without arrogance and without hesitation. I believe everyone has been trying to answer the wrong question. If you would allow me exactly 60 seconds, I think I can solve the challenge. I do not need 60 seconds to understand the mathematics, Zoe thought quietly as every pair of eyes settled upon her. I only need 60 seconds for everyone else to stop looking at the wrong answer. The executive boardroom remained perfectly silent. Even the soft sound of the building's ventilation system seemed unusually loud as 25 accomplished specialists stared toward the young housekeeper standing beside her cleaning cart. Richard Lawson slowly rose from his chair, his expression calm but unmistakably dismissive. "Christopher," he said, "this is not the time for distractions. We are responsible for $15 billion, not inspirational experiments." A few executives nodded awkwardly while several consultants lowered their eyes, unsure how the situation should be handled. Christopher Hayes, however, continued studying Zoe's face. What caught his attention was not confidence alone. It was peace. She showed no desire to impress anyone, no fear of failure, and no sign that she expected recognition. She simply waited with quiet patience, as though the decision already belonged entirely to him. Christopher finally broke the silence. "What is your name?" "Zoe Mitchell, sir." "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 3 years." "Do you have experience designing predictive systems?" Zoe answered honestly. "Not professionally, sir." Richard gave a restrained smile. "Then I believe this conversation has reached its natural conclusion." Christopher slowly raised one hand without taking his eyes away from Zoe. The room became silent once more. "You said everyone is answering the wrong question," he said. "Explain that." Zoe looked toward the towering display wall filled with glowing equations. "Every model in this room assumes the objective is already correct," she replied softly. "The experts are trying to improve an answer that was built upon the wrong objective from the very beginning." Several analysts instinctively turned back toward the display. Richard crossed his arms. "That objective has been verified repeatedly." Zoe respectfully nodded. "Yes, sir. It has been verified because everyone kept testing the same assumption. Nobody stopped to ask whether the assumption deserved to exist." Christopher glanced toward the digital countdown clock. 59 minutes remained. 8 hours of expert analysis had produced nothing except failure. One additional minute could not possibly make the situation worse. He stepped away from the conference table. "You have exactly 60 seconds. Richard immediately protested. "Christopher, this is reckless." Christopher answered calmly without looking away from Zoe. "The greatest risk now is believing we have already considered every possibility." Zoe thanked him with a gentle nod before carefully leaving her housekeeping cart beside the doorway. She walked quietly toward the enormous display wall while the entire boardroom watched every movement. She did not touch the keyboard immediately. Instead, she folded her hands and simply observed the data. Her eyes moved naturally across the artificial intelligence decision tree, international logistics projections, behavioral market forecasts, supplier relationships, and predictive confidence intervals. 20 seconds passed. 30. Several specialists exchanged skeptical glances. Richard checked his watch. 45 seconds. Zoe stepped slightly closer to the largest display. A small parameter hidden deep within the optimization sequence caught her attention. She smiled almost invisibly. "There it is," she whispered. Christopher approached. "What did you find?" Zoe pointed toward a single decision objective buried inside thousands of calculations. "The system is rewarding stability instead of adaptability." Several experts frowned with confusion. Zoe continued calmly. "The artificial intelligence has been trained to minimize short-term variation because that worked during previous acquisitions. But this challenge rewards resilience under changing market conditions. Every calculation after this point is mathematically correct. The objective itself is outdated." Christopher silently gave permission with a slight nod. Zoe changed one optimization priority. Only one. The artificial intelligence immediately began recalculating millions of interconnected variables. One crimson warning disappeared. Then another. Supply chain confidence increased. Market projections stabilized. International risk exposure fell dramatically. Within seconds, every warning indicator had transformed into calm blue confirmation panels. The final evaluation displayed a 99.1% probability of long-term success. Nobody spoke. One senior engineer immediately launched an independent verification. Another rebuilt the simulation from the beginning using a separate server. Every result confirmed the same conclusion. Richard stared silently at the display, unable to explain what had happened. Zoe quietly stepped away from the keyboard as though she had simply finished arranging another conference room. The system was never confused, she said gently. It was faithfully solving the problem it had been given. The difficulty was that everyone forgot to question whether the problem itself was still the right one. Christopher Hayes slowly looked from the flawless projections back toward the quiet young woman in the gray housekeeping uniform. And for the first time in his entire career, the billionaire who had trusted only credentials realized that genuine brilliance had just spoken with a voice almost everyone else had overlooked. For several long moments, nobody inside the executive boardroom seemed capable of speaking. The glowing display walls continued presenting flawless projections, while calm blue confirmation panels replaced every warning that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Around the conference table, accomplished specialists who had devoted their entire careers to solving impossible problems quietly reopened their laptops, convinced there had to be another explanation. One senior artificial intelligence architect rebuilt the complete predictive model using an isolated server. A financial analyst manually verified every revised calculation. Two systems engineers independently examined the optimization sequence from the beginning. Every verification produced the identical conclusion. Zoe Mitchell had corrected the only objective that truly determined the outcome. Richard Lawson remained standing near the conference table, his confidence visibly shaken for the first time in years. Run another validation, he instructed firmly. Every variable, every dependency. Nobody questioned the request. 7 minutes later, the lead engineer slowly removed his glasses and looked toward Christopher Hayes. The revised objective is mathematically correct. The challenge has been solved. Relief quietly spread throughout the room, but celebration never came. Instead, everyone found themselves looking toward the young housekeeper who had already stepped away from the display as though her part in the morning had ended. Christopher approached her with genuine curiosity. "Miss Mitchell," he asked calmly, "where did you learn to think this way?" Zoe smiled politely before answering. Life has a habit of teaching people to notice the questions everyone else forgets to ask. Richard frowned. "That is not a technical explanation." Zoe met his eyes respectfully. "No, sir. It is simply the truthful one." Christopher noticed something remarkable. She never attempted to sound mysterious or impressive. Every answer she gave felt natural, sincere, and completely free of pride. Before anyone could continue questioning her, an executive assistant entered carrying a stack of finalized legal documents. "Mr. Hayes, the international partners are waiting for your approval." Christopher reviewed the updated projections one final time before signing every page. The $15 billion partnership that had stood on the edge of collapse only minutes earlier was officially secured. Quiet applause filled the boardroom as exhausted executives finally allowed themselves to breathe again. Christopher turned back toward Zoe. "Please remain after the meeting. There are many things I would like to discuss." Zoe glanced toward the elegant clock mounted beside the conference room entrance. "I am sorry, sir," she replied gently. "The executive offices still need to be prepared before the afternoon meetings begin. If I stay much longer, several departments will arrive before their conference rooms are ready." Several executives exchanged astonished looks. After rescuing the company's most important challenge of the year, she was thinking about polished tables and freshwater pitchers. Christopher understood immediately that she was completely sincere. "Thank you, Miss Mitchell," he said quietly. "You may continue with your work." Zoe nodded gratefully, returned to the doorway, placed both hands on the handle of her housekeeping cart, and calmly continued down the marble hallway exactly as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She paused only once to greet a receptionist with a warm smile before disappearing around the corner. Silence settled over the boardroom again. Richard finally spoke. "She guessed correctly. Extraordinary luck still happens." Christopher slowly closed the acquisition folder and looked toward the empty hallway. "Luck does not identify an outdated optimization objective hidden inside millions of calculations," he answered calmly. "Luck does not remain composed while 25 experts disagree." Richard folded his arms. "Then who exactly is she?" Christopher remained thoughtful for several seconds before pressing the intercom button built into the conference table. "Daniel," he said to his chief of staff, "I want every employment record, educational archive, background report, and public document connected to Zoe Mitchell delivered to my office before this afternoon." Quiet requests immediately moved through Hayes Technologies' internal systems. Human Resources reopened archived personnel files. Employment agencies reviewed old records. Background investigators searched every available database. Yet as the reports slowly began arriving throughout the afternoon, one unexpected truth became impossible to ignore. The woman who had quietly solved a challenge that defeated the nation's brightest experts appeared to have almost no remarkable history at all, and the more Christopher searched for the story of Zoe Mitchell, the more mysterious her ordinary life became. By the following Monday morning, Hayes Technologies had returned to its familiar rhythm, at least on the surface. Employees celebrated the successful completion of the international partnership, investors praised the company's performance, and financial publications described Christopher Hayes as the executive who had once again delivered an impossible victory. Yet inside Christopher's office, the accomplishment that occupied his thoughts had nothing to do with stock prices or business headlines. A slim digital file rested on his desk containing every record his staff had managed to locate about Zoe Mitchell. He reviewed each page slowly. 27 years old. Housekeeping employee. Nearly 3 years assigned to Hayes Technologies through a facilities management contractor. Outstanding attendance. Exceptional work evaluations. Previous employment included a neighborhood bookstore, a small hotel, and an office cleaning company in Brooklyn. No advanced degrees. No patents. No published research. Nothing remotely explained the extraordinary reasoning she had demonstrated inside the executive boardroom. Christopher pressed the intercom. "Daniel, come in." Moments later, his chief of staff entered carrying another folder. "I have searched every public database we could legally access," Daniel explained. Employment history, education records, professional licenses, conference attendance, published research, everything. Christopher looked up. "What did you find?" Daniel gave a thoughtful sigh. "Almost nothing. It is as though someone lived an entirely ordinary life, while quietly making sure nobody ever noticed how extraordinary they really were." Christopher leaned back in silence. Throughout his career, he had encountered celebrated entrepreneurs, brilliant engineers, decorated professors, and executives who proudly displayed every achievement they had ever earned. Zoe had done exactly the opposite. She had solved the greatest challenge his company had faced in years, then quietly returned to polishing conference tables before anyone could even thank her properly. The contradiction refused to leave his mind. Across the executive floor, Richard Lawson had also begun watching Zoe more carefully, although his reasons remained very different. He still believed that remarkable ability demanded repeated proof. Without informing Christopher, he privately instructed several department managers not to interfere with Zoe's work, but simply to observe. "If what happened in the boardroom was genuine," he told them calmly, "we will eventually see it happen again." 3 days later, another unexpected situation emerged. The engineering division prepared to demonstrate a prototype logistics platform for visiting investors when every large presentation display suddenly began showing conflicting versions of the same operational data. Shipping routes no longer matched warehouse inventories. Inventory forecasts contradicted supplier schedules, and every team insisted their information was correct. Software engineers immediately examined the network while analysts searched for corrupted files. The confusion spread quickly as valuable meeting time slipped away. Zoe happened to be replacing fresh coffee supplies near the conference room entrance. She quietly listened while several managers debated possible causes. After a brief moment, she asked one gentle question. "May I know when the warehouse software was updated?" One manager answered without hesitation. "Last Friday evening." Zoe nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps the new system is reading live information while one of the presentation dashboards is still using archived synchronization intervals." The information technology team immediately checked the synchronization settings. Less than 2 minutes later, they discovered that one dashboard had continued refreshing from an outdated reporting schedule after the weekend software upgrade. The conflicting information disappeared almost instantly once the synchronization interval was corrected. One engineer stared at Zoe with open amazement. "How did you think of that?" She smiled politely while lifting the coffee tray. Sometimes the answer is hiding inside the moment when two good systems stop speaking the same language. She quietly continued preparing the meeting room before anyone could ask another question. From the glass balcony overlooking the engineering floor, Richard had watched the entire exchange. This time there had been no luck, no coincidence, and no dramatic guess. Once again, Zoe had noticed the hidden assumption that everyone else had accepted without question. Richard slowly folded his arms as an unfamiliar feeling settled across his thoughts. For the first time in his professional career, he found himself wondering whether the quiet woman pushing a housekeeping cart understood complex systems more deeply than many of the celebrated experts whose opinions he had trusted for decades. Ironically, the answer Christopher Hayes had searched for through databases, employment records, and professional archives finally appeared inside a forgotten university document that almost escaped everyone's attention. Late on Friday afternoon, Daniel entered Christopher's office carrying a thin envelope that had arrived from an academic records department after several delayed archive requests. "This is the only document they were willing to release," Daniel explained. "Everything else was sealed after a voluntary withdrawal." Christopher immediately opened the envelope. Inside rested a faded scholarship certificate bearing the name Zoe Mitchell. Beneath it appeared the title of one of the country's most prestigious research fellowships in intelligent systems analysis, a scholarship awarded each year to only one undergraduate student nationwide. Christopher slowly looked up in disbelief. "Only one recipient." Daniel nodded. "The committee described her as the most promising systems thinker of her generation." Christopher continued reading. Faculty recommendations praised Zoe's extraordinary ability to recognize hidden patterns inside complex decision models long before experienced researchers could identify them. One professor had written a single sentence that immediately caught Christopher's attention. "She never begins by asking whether the answer is correct. She begins by asking whether the question deserves to exist." Christopher quietly leaned back in his chair. Those words perfectly described the young woman who had transformed an impossible corporate challenge in only 60 seconds. Yet another page deepened the mystery instead of solving it. 6 months after receiving the scholarship, Zoe voluntarily withdrew from the entire research program. No disciplinary action, no academic failure, no controversy. Simply a signed request ending one of the brightest academic careers before it had truly begun. Did they explain why? Christopher asked softly. Daniel shook his head. "The withdrawal letter is confidential. The university would not release it." That evening, Christopher remained inside his office long after most employees had gone home. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan glowed beneath thousands of city lights while traffic moved steadily across bridges connecting neighborhoods that never seemed to sleep. He found himself thinking less about technology and more about choice. Why would someone capable of extraordinary achievements willingly exchange world-class research laboratories for housekeeping work? The following morning, Christopher unexpectedly saw Zoe leaving the headquarters carrying a small paper bag instead of heading toward the subway immediately. Curious but careful not to intrude, he remained several steps behind while walking toward the street. Zoe stopped at a neighborhood bakery before purchasing a warm apple pie. From there, she boarded a subway train traveling toward Brooklyn. Christopher chose not to follow further, believing everyone deserved private moments beyond the workplace. On Monday morning, Daniel quietly entered Christopher's office again, carrying another report. "We located the emergency contact listed in Zoe's employment records," he said gently. "It is a long-term nursing care residence in Brooklyn." Christopher immediately remembered the faded scholarship certificate resting inside his desk drawer. Daniel continued softly. "According to publicly available records, her mother has lived there for several years while receiving ongoing medical care." Christopher remained silent. He did not need anyone to finish the story for him. The missing pieces were beginning to arrange themselves naturally. The abandoned scholarship, the ordinary jobs, the quiet life. The remarkable absence of ambition despite extraordinary ability. Every clue pointed toward the same conclusion. Zoe had not failed to achieve the future everyone expected from her. She had chosen a different future entirely. Yet Christopher still lacked certainty, and assumptions had already taught him an unforgettable lesson. Later that afternoon, Hayes Technologies received an invitation to host one of the country's most respected technology education forums the following week. Distinguished researchers, university presidents, and internationally recognized professors would attend the event. Christopher accepted immediately. Somewhere deep inside, he carried an unexpected feeling that the answers he had been searching for might finally arrive from someone who had known Zoe long before the world forgot her extraordinary name. The National Technology Education Forum arrived beneath a clear autumn sky, transforming the headquarters of Hayes Technologies into one of the most prestigious gathering places for innovation in the country. Distinguished professors, university presidents, corporate leaders, researchers, and industry pioneers filled the elegant reception hall as sunlight streamed through towering glass walls overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Every detail reflected quiet excellence. Fresh floral arrangements decorated the entrances, polished marble floors mirrored the morning light, and soft conversations echoed throughout the spacious atrium as guests prepared for the opening session. Behind the scenes, Zoe Mitchell followed the same routine she had repeated hundreds of times before. Wearing her neatly pressed gray housekeeping uniform, she carefully adjusted conference tables, arranged water glasses, and ensured every meeting room welcomed its guests with the same attention to detail she brought to every ordinary day. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had once stood among the nation's brightest academic minds. Shortly before the keynote address, an elderly gentleman entered the reception hall accompanied by several university officials. His silver hair, gentle smile, and unmistakable presence immediately drew respectful greetings from nearly everyone nearby. Professor William Bennett had spent more than 40 years teaching advanced computational systems at one of America's most respected universities. Generations of engineers credited him for shaping their careers, and his annual keynote speech had become one of the most anticipated moments of the entire forum. As Professor Bennett slowly greeted colleagues along the reception area, his attention suddenly stopped. He looked across the room toward Zoe, who was quietly placing fresh notebooks beside the conference seats. For several long seconds he remained completely still, almost as though he doubted his own memory. Then his face brightened with unmistakable joy. "Zoe," he called gently. Zoe turned around, immediately recognizing the familiar voice. Her eyes filled with genuine warmth. "Professor Bennett," she replied with a smile. "It has been many years." Their greeting immediately attracted Christopher Hayes' attention from across the hall. Richard Lawson also noticed the unexpected familiarity between one of the country's most respected professors and the quiet housekeeper everyone believed they already understood. Curious guests gradually fell silent as Professor Bennett walked directly toward Zoe. Christopher approached politely. "Professor Bennett," he asked, "you know Miss Mitchell?" The elderly professor looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Know her?" He smiled proudly before placing one hand gently across his chest. "Young man, I have spent the last 7 years telling every graduating class about this remarkable woman." Complete silence settled across the reception hall. Professor Bennett continued with unmistakable admiration. Before she reached 21 years of age, Zoe developed analytical frameworks that visiting researchers twice her age struggled to understand. She earned the highest research fellowship our university had awarded in more than a decade. We believed she would become one of the defining scientific minds of her generation. Richard's confident expression disappeared completely. Christopher stood speechless. Every missing piece of the puzzle suddenly began falling into place. Professor Bennett looked warmly toward Zoe before continuing more softly. The finest laboratories in America invited her to join their research teams. She could have chosen almost any career she wished. Christopher finally asked the question that had occupied his thoughts for weeks. Then why did she disappear? Zoe lowered her eyes peacefully before answering. "Because my mother needed me more than the future I had planned." Professor Bennett nodded with quiet understanding. "She came to my office carrying her fellowship papers. I thought she had come to celebrate. Instead, she thanked every professor who had encouraged her and quietly withdrew from the program. She never complained. She never asked for sympathy. She simply said that opportunities may return someday, but time with the people we love never does." No one spoke. Christopher remembered the nursing care residence listed inside Zoe's employment file, the forgotten scholarship certificate, the ordinary jobs, and the quiet dignity she carried every single day. At that moment, he finally understood that Zoe Mitchell had never abandoned greatness. She had simply measured success by a standard far more meaningful than recognition, proving that the strongest people are often those willing to sacrifice extraordinary dreams for extraordinary love. I have often discovered that the strongest apology is not the one spoken with perfect words, but the one offered after a person finally sees the truth. The reception hall remained completely silent as Professor William Bennett's final words settled into the hearts of everyone present. Distinguished researchers, university presidents, executives, investors, and technology leaders who had gathered to celebrate innovation now found themselves reflecting on something far greater than scientific achievement. They had spent the morning admiring advanced technology while overlooking one of the most remarkable human beings standing quietly among them. Christopher Hayes looked at Zoe Mitchell with entirely different eyes than he had only weeks earlier. He remembered the first morning she had interrupted the boardroom, the calm certainty in her voice, the simple gray housekeeping uniform, and the extraordinary humility she had displayed even after solving a challenge that had defeated 25 of the country's brightest experts. He slowly stepped forward until he stood directly before her. Every conversation throughout the reception hall faded into silence. There were no prepared remarks, no corporate announcements, and no carefully managed public relations strategy. There was only honesty. Christopher took a slow breath before speaking. "Miss Mitchell, I believed I understood how to recognize talent. I now realize I only understood how to recognize credentials." Zoe immediately offered a gentle smile. "Please, sir, there is no reason to apologize." Christopher quietly shook his head. "There is every reason." His voice remained calm, but unmistakably sincere. "When you first entered that boardroom, I believed I was taking a risk by allowing you 60 seconds. The truth is that you were taking the greater risk by trusting that someone might actually listen." The audience remained perfectly still. Christopher continued, "I built this company by searching for exceptional people. Somehow, I allowed myself to believe exceptional people always arrived with impressive titles, expensive suits, and celebrated reputations. You reminded me that wisdom does not introduce itself through status. It introduces itself through character." Several executives lowered their eyes, remembering how quickly they had dismissed the quiet housekeeper standing beside her cleaning cart. Richard Lawson slowly stepped forward. His confident posture had softened into genuine humility. Looking directly at Zoe, he spoke with complete honesty. "I judged your uniform before I ever considered your mind. I assumed experience could always be measured by position. I was wrong, and I sincerely ask your forgiveness." Zoe looked at him with the same peaceful kindness she had shown from the very beginning. There was no satisfaction in seeing others admit their mistakes. There was only compassion. "We all make decisions based on what we have learned," she answered gently. "The important question is whether we are willing to learn something better tomorrow." Professor Bennett smiled quietly, recognizing the same grace that had inspired generations of students years earlier. Christopher turned toward the distinguished guests filling the reception hall. "Today, Hayes Technologies learned a lesson more valuable than any business success we have ever achieved," he said. "Innovation begins the moment we stop deciding whose ideas deserve to be heard before they are even spoken." Warm applause gradually filled the hall, growing stronger as more people rose to their feet. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, yet Zoe never looked comfortable standing at the center of attention. As the applause slowly faded, she quietly excused herself, gathered the empty water pitchers from a nearby table, and resumed preparing the next conference room exactly as she had done every morning before anyone knew her story. Christopher watched her disappear through the hallway carrying the same quiet dignity that had never changed, whether she stood unnoticed beside a housekeeping cart or before the most respected leaders in the country. In that simple moment, he understood that genuine greatness is never transformed by recognition. Recognition simply allows the rest of the world to finally see the greatness that was already there all along. The Monday after the Technology Forum felt different from every other Monday in the history of Hayes Technologies. Employees sensed the change before anyone officially announced it. Executives who normally hurried past reception paused to greet security officers by name. Department managers invited administrative assistants into planning discussions. Engineers stopped to thank maintenance crews preparing laboratories before important demonstrations. The atmosphere had become quieter, warmer, and unexpectedly more human. Christopher Hayes understood that changing a company would require far more than one emotional speech. It demanded new habits, new expectations, and a new way of recognizing value. Early that morning, he invited Zoe Mitchell into his executive office. Sunlight filled the spacious room overlooking Manhattan as she entered wearing the same neatly pressed gray housekeeping uniform she had worn every day since joining the company. Nothing about her appearance reflected the admiration she had recently received. She remained the same thoughtful woman who preferred meaningful work over attention. Christopher welcomed her with a sincere smile. "Thank you for coming, Zoe." She nodded politely. "You asked to see me, sir." Christopher placed a carefully prepared folder on the conference table. "Please sit down." Zoe quietly accepted the invitation. Inside the folder rested a proposal unlike any Hayes Technologies had created before. The position carried a simple title: Director of Innovation Culture. Christopher waited while she read each page. The proposal described a new leadership role responsible for connecting employees across every department, encouraging collaboration, identifying overlooked talent, and ensuring valuable ideas could never again be dismissed because of someone's job title or background. When Zoe finished reading, she gently closed the folder and looked toward Christopher with quiet curiosity. "Why me?" Christopher answered without hesitation. "Because every executive I have ever hired understood how to improve business systems. You taught me how to improve the way people see one another." The room became peaceful once again. Zoe reflected silently before speaking. "If I accept this responsibility, I would like to ask for one promise." Christopher smiled warmly. "Name it." Zoe folded her hands together. "Please do not create this role because of what happened to me. Create it because someone else may one day have an idea that could change everything, and they deserve to be heard before anyone judges where they work." Christopher nodded immediately. "You have my word." Within weeks, Hayes Technologies introduced a company-wide initiative called Every Voice First. Once each month, employees from every department gathered in mixed teams to solve real organizational challenges together. Housekeeping staff worked beside software architects. Receptionists collaborated with financial analysts. Security officers shared ideas with senior engineers. Interns presented directly to executive leadership. At first, many employees felt uncertain. Years of workplace hierarchy could not disappear overnight. Then remarkable changes quietly began appearing throughout the organization. A facilities technician redesigned the building's energy management process, reducing operating costs significantly. A receptionist suggested a simpler visitor scheduling system that improved customer experience across every office. A warehouse coordinator proposed a logistics improvement that eliminated recurring delivery delays. Christopher attended every session, listening far more often than speaking. Richard Lawson also participated, but his leadership had transformed. Instead of asking who proposed each idea, he began asking how the team reached its conclusion. One afternoon, Christopher found Zoe walking through the headquarters after another successful workshop. Although she now held an executive leadership position, she still greeted custodians with genuine gratitude, congratulated interns after presentations, and thanked cafeteria employees for preparing meals. Recognition had changed her responsibilities, but never her character. Christopher walked beside her through the bright central atrium. "Do you ever regret leaving the future everyone expected you to have?" he asked quietly. Zoe looked toward the afternoon sunlight filling the building before answering with her familiar calm smile. "The future I imagined changed many years ago, but sometimes life replaces the dream we planned with a purpose we never expected. When that purpose helps other people discover their own value, it becomes something even greater than success." Christopher quietly reflected on her words as employees throughout Hayes Technologies continued sharing ideas without worrying about titles, realizing that the greatest innovation his company would ever achieve was not another breakthrough in technology, but a culture where respect always arrived before judgment. "I once believed that success was measured by the height of the building a person worked in, but life eventually taught me that true greatness is measured by the depth of the heart that guides every decision." 1 year later, Hayes Technologies had become one of the fastest growing and most admired companies in America, but the achievements celebrated most often by business leaders had very little to do with financial performance. Universities visited the headquarters to study its remarkable culture. International executives requested private tours to understand how collaboration had replaced hierarchy. Business journals praised an organization where remarkable ideas were welcomed before impressive titles were considered. Yet Christopher Hayes knew that none of those accomplishments represented the company's greatest success. Early one autumn morning, he entered the headquarters before sunrise, just as he had done countless times throughout his career. The spacious atrium stood peacefully beneath soft golden light streaming through towering glass walls. Employees slowly began arriving for another workday, greeting one another with genuine warmth instead of quiet formality. Engineers stopped to speak with receptionists. Senior executives thanked custodians preparing meeting rooms. Interns confidently exchanged ideas with department directors. The invisible walls that had once separated people by position had quietly disappeared. Christopher paused before a polished stone wall newly installed in the center of the atrium. Carefully engraved across its surface were the words that had become the guiding principle of Hayes Technologies. Great ideas are born in people, not positions. Every employee passed those words at the beginning of each workday, and many paused for just a moment before continuing toward their offices. Christopher smiled softly because he understood that those words did not belong to him. They belonged to the quiet woman whose courage had changed an entire company without ever seeking recognition. A few moments later, Zoe Mitchell entered the building carrying a simple notebook and a warm cup of coffee. Although she now served as Director of Innovation Culture, her daily routine remained remarkably familiar. She greeted the security officers by name, thanked the housekeeping team for preparing the conference rooms, congratulated a young intern after a successful presentation rehearsal, and stopped briefly to help a new employee locate the correct meeting space. Leadership had changed her responsibilities, but it had never changed her kindness. Christopher walked beside her with an easy smile. "Do you remember the morning you stood outside my boardroom with a housekeeping cart?" Zoe laughed gently. "I remember wondering whether anyone would believe me." Christopher looked toward the bustling atrium filled with people working together. "You solved a business challenge in 60 seconds, he said. "I think it took me much longer to understand the greater lesson." Zoe glanced around the building before answering quietly. "Sometimes the hardest problems are not technical. Sometimes they are the assumptions we never realize we are making." Later that afternoon, Christopher accompanied Zoe to the nursing care residence in Brooklyn, where her mother now enjoyed noticeably better health. The three of them spent the afternoon walking slowly through a peaceful garden filled with colorful autumn flowers while children laughed in a nearby park. As they shared homemade apple pie beneath the shade of old maple trees, Zoe's mother looked proudly toward her daughter before speaking softly. "People often think she gave up her future for me," she said. "What they never understood is that kindness became her future." Christopher remained silent because there was nothing left to add. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Manhattan skyline that evening, the lights inside Hayes Technologies began shining across the city once again. Somewhere inside those offices, another employee with an unnoticed idea was probably preparing to change something important, knowing their voice would finally be heard. Christopher realized that wealth could build extraordinary companies, intelligence could solve extraordinary challenges, and experience could create extraordinary success. But only humility could uncover the extraordinary value hidden inside ordinary lives. That lesson became the greatest legacy Hayes Technologies would ever leave behind, proving that the world changes not when brilliant people become powerful, but when powerful people finally learn to recognize brilliance wherever it quietly exists.